What if the biggest royal controversy of the year isn't about money, interviews, or even family drama? What if it's about a title? For years, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have remained at the center of headlines. Every move they make sparks debate. Every business project attracts attention. And every royal appearance fuels a brand new wave of speculation. But now, royal watchers are focusing on something completely different. Across newspapers, commentators, and royal discussion circles, one question keeps appearing. What happens if a future King William decides the rules surrounding royal titles need to change? Some analysts believe the conversation is bigger than Meghan herself. Others say it's simply another round of royal speculation. But what makes this story unusual is that several separate discussions about branding, public perception, royal protocol, and future leadership have suddenly collided at the same time. And that's why people are paying attention. Because if even part of these reports turn out to be true, the consequences could stretch far beyond headlines. Tonight we are breaking down the claims, the speculation, the reported plans, and the questions that royal insiders can't seem to stop discussing. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why so many people believe this story is only just beginning. For years, royal controversies have followed Prince Harry and Meghan Markle wherever they go. A new interview appears, a new project launches, a new headline explodes across social media, and suddenly millions of people are arguing about the same question all over again. But according to some royal commentators, the latest discussion feels different. Why? Because this time the conversation isn't centered on an interview, a podcast, or a documentary. It's centered on a title. And more importantly, whether that title has become the foundation of an entire commercial brand. Now, before we go any further, it's important to understand that many of the claims being discussed online remain matters of debate and interpretation. Different royal experts disagree strongly on what certain agreements actually mean. But what nobody disagrees on is this: the controversy exists. And it's getting louder. According to reports discussed in royal media circles, attention intensified after public conversations emerged regarding how royal titles were being referenced in different contexts. Some commentators argued that there appeared to be inconsistencies in the public messaging surrounding title usage. Others insisted there was no contradiction at all and that critics were simply trying to manufacture a scandal. That disagreement alone would normally fade away within days. But this one didn't. Instead, it kept growing. Because once people started looking at the details, they began connecting separate pieces of information that had previously been discussed individually. One discussion involved branding. Another involved royal protocol. Another involved future royal leadership. And suddenly those separate conversations started merging into one much larger question. What happens if a future monarch decides to take a harder line than previous royal leadership? That's the question driving endless speculation right now. And at the center of that speculation sits Prince William. Not because he has publicly announced any such plan. Not because Buckingham Palace has issued any dramatic statement. But because royal observers continue analyzing every reported comment, every biographer claim, and every insider report for clues about how William might approach the monarchy when his time eventually arrives. For some royal watchers, the answer is obvious. They believe William represents continuity. For others, William represents change. And that's where things become interesting. Because some authors and commentators have claimed that William may take a much firmer approach toward royal matters than many people expect. Again, those claims remain opinions and interpretations rather than confirmed policy. But they have fueled enormous discussion, especially when combined with reports about business ventures associated with Meghan Markle's public image. Supporters argue that Meghan has every right to build a successful post-royal career. Critics argue that the connection between commercial branding and royal identity raises legitimate questions. Neither side appears willing to back down. And that's exactly why this story keeps generating headlines. What's fascinating is that the debate isn't really about products. It's not about websites. It's not about social media followers. Those are only surface-level issues. The real debate happening underneath all of this is about value. Specifically, where that value comes from. When people purchase products connected to a celebrity, what are they actually buying? The product itself? The personality? The reputation? The story? Or something else entirely? Royal commentators have been asking exactly that question. Because some argue that public interest surrounding Harry and Meghan has always been closely linked to their royal connection. Others strongly disagree. They argue that the couple built an audience independent of royal status and would remain influential regardless of titles. It's a debate with no clear answer, but it becomes much more significant when discussions about future title policies enter the conversation. Imagine two completely different scenarios. In the first scenario, nothing changes. Titles remain exactly as they are. Business projects continue. Media coverage continues. The debate slowly fades. In the second scenario, some kind of major royal decision changes the landscape. Suddenly, every agreement, every brand strategy, every public perception calculation looks different. That's why analysts keep discussing possibilities. Not because they know what will happen, but because nobody knows. And uncertainty creates attention. Attention creates headlines. Headlines create speculation. And speculation fuels the entire cycle. What's remarkable is how many different groups are now involved in the conversation. Royal biographers, royal correspondents, television commentators, YouTube analysts, social media creators, former palace staff members. Each group brings its own perspective. Each group highlights different evidence. And each group reaches different conclusions. Some believe the controversy is massively overblown. Others believe it could become one of the defining royal stories of the decade. That difference in opinion is exactly what keeps audiences watching. Because people love mysteries. And right now, this story feels like a mystery. Not because facts are hidden, but because the future remains unknown. Nobody can predict exactly what a future King William would do. Nobody can predict how public opinion might evolve. Nobody can predict how royal institutions will adapt to changing times. Yet everyone wants to try. And that's where the emotional side of the story begins to emerge. Because beneath the legal theories and branding discussions lies a much more human narrative. Two brothers. One family. Years of public tension. Years of media coverage. Years of competing narratives. Every new headline gets filtered through that larger story. Every disagreement becomes symbolic. Every rumor becomes amplified. Every report becomes part of a much bigger picture. Whether that's fair or unfair depends on who you ask. But it's impossible to ignore. The relationship between William and Harry remains one of the most closely watched dynamics in modern royal history. And because of that, any discussion involving one brother immediately becomes a discussion involving the other. That's exactly what's happening here. A conversation about titles has become a conversation about power. A conversation about branding has become a conversation about legacy. A conversation about future possibilities has become a conversation about the future shape of the monarchy itself. And according to many observers, that's why this controversy refuses to disappear. Because the deeper people look, the bigger the questions become. But if this debate truly started with a contradiction, then the next question becomes obvious. Was that contradiction simply a misunderstanding? Or was it the first visible sign of a much larger battle quietly unfolding behind the scenes? If part 1 was about the contradiction that reignited this controversy, then part 2 is about the question that has royal commentators completely divided. Not whether Prince William is angry. Not whether family tensions still exist. Not even whether future changes are possible. The real question is far more significant. Has William already decided what kind of king he wants to be? Because according to several royal commentators, that's the piece of the puzzle that changes everything. For years, the public image of Prince William has been carefully built around stability, duty, and continuity. Unlike many public figures, William rarely responds directly to controversy. He doesn't normally enter public arguments. He rarely addresses speculation. And that silence has created an unusual situation. People have started interpreting what he doesn't say. Every appearance becomes analyzed. Every interview becomes dissected. Every public interaction becomes evidence for one side or another. And nowhere is that more visible than in discussions surrounding Harry and Meghan. Some royal analysts argue that William's silence speaks louder than words. Others insist that people are reading far too much into ordinary royal behavior. But regardless of which side is correct, one fact remains undeniable. The speculation continues growing. Why? Because many royal watchers believe William is playing a long game. Not a public game. Not a media game. A monarchy game. The kind of game measured in years rather than weeks. The kind of game where decisions are made slowly and implemented carefully. And according to several biographers, That's exactly how William has always operated. Reports from royal authors often describe him as someone who remembers details, values loyalty, and takes time before making major decisions. These are interpretations from commentators rather than confirmed facts, but they have heavily influenced how many people view him. That perception has become incredibly important. Because once people believe someone is patient, every delay begins to look intentional. Every silence begins to look strategic. Every absence begins to look meaningful. And that's precisely what has happened. Royal observers frequently point to public appearances where William speaks openly about family, friends, charities, sports, and royal responsibilities while avoiding discussion of ongoing controversies. Supporters say that's professionalism. Critics say it's calculated distance. Either way, people notice. And when people notice patterns, they start asking questions. The biggest question being this: if William eventually becomes king, what happens on day one? It's a simple question, but it generates incredibly complicated answers. Some experts believe almost nothing would change immediately. Historically, new monarchs often focus on stability during the early stages of their reign. Others believe a new king may choose to send a message about priorities, expectations, and the future direction of the institution. That possibility has fueled endless online debate. And that's where the title controversy enters the picture again. Because many of the rumors currently circulating aren't actually about Meghan. They're about authority. Who has it? How it's used? And what happens when leadership changes? For many royal watchers, the Meghan discussion simply becomes the most visible example of a much larger conversation. A conversation about modernization. A conversation about accountability. A conversation about public trust. And perhaps most importantly, a conversation about image. Because modern monarchies operate differently than they did generations ago. Every decision is scrutinized globally. Every announcement spreads instantly. Every controversy becomes international. That reality creates enormous pressure. Pressure to protect traditions. Pressure to adapt to modern expectations. Pressure to balance public opinion with institutional stability. According to some commentators, William understands that challenge better than almost anyone. Whether that's true or not remains a matter of interpretation. But it explains why so many analysts keep focusing on him. Not because of what he has done, but because of what he might do. And in the world of royal coverage, possibility is often more powerful than reality. That's why headlines keep appearing. That's why commentators keep debating. That's why audiences keep clicking. Everyone wants a glimpse into the future. Everyone wants to know what comes next. Yet nobody actually knows. And that uncertainty creates a vacuum. A vacuum quickly filled by rumors. One rumor becomes a theory. One theory becomes a headline. One headline becomes a viral discussion. Before long, millions of people are talking about something that hasn't happened. That's exactly where this story sits today. In the space between possibility and reality. Some commentators believe future action is inevitable. Others believe it's pure speculation. The truth remains unknown. But what's fascinating is how many respected royal writers continue discussing similar themes. Not necessarily the same conclusions. Not necessarily the same predictions. But the same underlying idea. That William may have a very different vision for the monarchy than previous generations. Whether that vision includes changes affecting Harry and Meghan remains impossible to confirm. Yet the discussion continues anyway. Because the relationship between public image and royal authority has become impossible to ignore. And for many observers, that relationship lies at the center of everything. Think about it. Why do titles matter? Why do symbols matter? Why do traditions matter? Because institutions rely on them. They create identity. They create legitimacy. They create continuity. Remove those symbols, and people begin asking different questions. Questions about relevance. Questions about influence. Questions about value. That's exactly why discussions about titles generate so much attention. The conversation isn't really about words on paper. It's about what those words represent. And according to many commentators, William understands that better than anyone. Which brings us to the most intriguing possibility of all. What if the real story isn't about removing anything? What if the real story is about redefining expectations? Because sometimes power isn't demonstrated through dramatic action. Sometimes power is demonstrated through patience. through silence, through waiting, through allowing circumstances to develop naturally. Many analysts believe that approach would fit Williams' personality perfectly. Again, that's speculation. But it's speculation based on years of observation. Years of watching how he responds to pressure. Years of watching how he handles controversy. Years of watching how he positions himself within the institution. And according to supporters of this theory, the pattern is remarkably consistent. Slow, deliberate, measured, strategic. Whether that's accurate remains a matter of opinion. But it helps explain why this story refuses to disappear. Because the more people discuss Williams' future role, the more attention shifts away from current controversies and toward future possibilities. Possibilities that could reshape royal headlines for years to come. And that's where the next chapter becomes even more interesting. Because while commentators debate future plans, another question has started emerging. A question involving money. A question involving branding. A question involving public interest itself. And according to some analysts, that question may ultimately prove more important than any royal title. Because if public attention begins changing, everything else changes with it. Up until now, this story has been about titles, about royal protocol, about speculation regarding Prince William's future decisions. But according to many royal commentators, none of those topics represent the biggest threat facing Meghan Markle's public brand. The biggest threat might be something much simpler: attention. Because in today's world, attention is currency. And when attention changes direction, entire business strategies can change with it. This is where the story takes a fascinating turn. For years, discussions surrounding Harry and Meghan have generated enormous global interest. Whether people supported them or criticized them, millions kept watching. Millions kept reading.
Millions kept clicking.
And in the digital age, that kind of attention has extraordinary value. Streaming companies want it. Publishers want it. Advertisers want it. Brands want it. Everyone wants access to audiences. Which raises an uncomfortable question many commentators have started asking. What exactly are audiences interested in? The people? Or the royal connection? That debate has become one of the most controversial discussions in royal media. Supporters argue that Harry and Meghan have built a global audience independent of royal status. Critics argue that much of the interest remains linked to their royal story. Neither side agrees. And neither side seems likely to change its position anytime soon. But what's interesting is that several commentators point to a pattern. Whenever a story directly involves royal conflict, royal titles, royal institutions, or royal controversy, public engagement appears to surge. Discussions around projects that focus less on royal drama often generate different levels of attention. These interpretations have become a major talking point among royal analysts. That observation has fueled endless debate. Because if attention is connected to the royal story itself, then future changes to that story become enormously important. Imagine a movie franchise. The audience falls in love with the characters, but they also fall in love with the universe those characters belong to. Remove the universe. Remove the mythology. Remove the conflict. And suddenly the audience behaves differently. That's the theory some commentators are applying here. Again, it's a theory, not a proven fact. But it's one that continues gaining traction among royal observers. Because when people analyze modern celebrity brands, they often look for a core value proposition. In simple terms, why does the audience care? And according to some analysts, that question becomes increasingly important when discussing Meghan's business ventures. Not because her projects lack quality, not because her audience lacks loyalty, but because branding depends on identity. Identity creates recognition. Recognition creates demand. Demand creates value. That's how modern celebrity businesses work. Which is why discussions about titles quickly become discussions about business. The two topics are connected whether supporters like it or not. And that's where the financial side of this story begins. Royal commentators often argue that public perception has become one of the most valuable assets in modern media. A strong public image can open doors. A strong public image can attract partnerships. A strong public image can create opportunities. But public perception is also unpredictable. It changes. It evolves. It shifts. Sometimes rapidly. Sometimes without warning. And that's exactly why analysts continue watching the Sussex brand so closely. Because from a business perspective, It represents one of the most fascinating public image case studies in the world. Few people generate stronger reactions. Few people dominate headlines more consistently. Few people attract such passionate supporters and critics at the same time. That combination creates enormous visibility. But it also creates enormous pressure. Every project gets analyzed. Every partnership gets examined. Every public move gets evaluated. Successes become headlines. Challenges become headlines. Everything becomes a story. Which means the financial side of the discussion can never be separated from the public side. The two are connected. Completely connected. And according to some commentators, that's where future risks begin appearing. Not because of any single decision. Not because of any single controversy. But because public interest itself can change. History shows this repeatedly. Celebrity brands rise. Celebrity brands peak. Celebrity brands evolve. Sometimes they reinvent themselves successfully. Sometimes they struggle. Nobody can predict which path any public figure will follow. And that's true for Meghan as well. Supporters believe she remains one of the most recognizable women in the world. Critics argue that recognition doesn't automatically guarantee long-term commercial success. Both perspectives contain elements worth considering. Which is why the financial debate remains so intense. Because nobody really knows what the future looks like. Some analysts believe the Sussex brand still has enormous untapped potential. Others believe its strongest years are already behind it. Again, opinions vary dramatically. But here's what makes the discussion so compelling. Regardless of which side is correct, everyone agrees on one thing. The next few years matter. A lot. Because this is the period where long-term identity begins taking shape. Will the brand continue evolving beyond royal connections? Will audiences embrace entirely new directions? Will future projects redefine public perception? Those questions remain unanswered. Yet investors, media companies, publishers, and business partners pay close attention to them. Why? Because uncertainty creates risk. And risk affects decisions. Even if nobody says so publicly. That's why analysts often focus on business structures, trademarks, partnerships, and branding strategies. Some commentators have suggested that separating business entities from personal titles reflects long-term planning for multiple future scenarios. Whether that interpretation is accurate remains open to debate. But it demonstrates how closely people are watching. Every filing becomes a clue. Every announcement becomes a clue. Every strategic move becomes a clue. People aren't just analyzing what exists today. They're trying to predict tomorrow. And tomorrow is where things become truly interesting. Because if financial strength depends partly on public interest, and public interest depends partly on narrative, then whoever controls the narrative gains a powerful advantage. That's where William enters the story again. Not because he controls public opinion. No one does. But because future royal developments could influence public conversations in ways nobody can fully predict. One announcement can dominate headlines. One royal transition can reshape media attention. One major institutional decision can change the entire conversation. That's why commentators continue linking financial discussions to royal discussions. The two worlds constantly overlap. And according to some analysts, the overlap is becoming impossible to ignore. But there's an even bigger question waiting around the corner. A question that moves beyond branding. Beyond public relations. Beyond media strategy. A question involving law. Because if titles, branding, and business become interconnected, what happens when legal interpretations enter the conversation? That's the question fueling the next stage of this controversy. And according to some royal observers, it may be the most important question of all. If part 3 was about money, then part 4 is about something many royal commentators believe matters even more. The rules. Because attention can rise. Attention can fall. Public opinion can change overnight. But institutions survive because of rules. And according to many royal analysts, the biggest question surrounding this entire controversy is not whether Meghan is popular. Not whether William is frustrated. Not whether public opinion is shifting. The real question is this: what do the rules actually allow? Because once lawyers enter the conversation, emotions stop mattering. Headlines stop mattering. Social media debates stop mattering. Only documents matter. Only agreements matter. Only legal interpretations matter. And that's exactly why so many royal observers have suddenly become interested in a topic that most people would normally find incredibly boring: royal paperwork. Because behind every title exists a legal framework. Behind every royal privilege exists a legal framework. Behind every royal designation exists a legal framework. Most people never think about it. Until controversy arrives. Then suddenly everyone wants answers. That's exactly what's happening now. Across royal media circles, commentators continue debating whether future changes involving titles would even be possible. Some argue yes. Others argue no. Some insist there are powerful legal obstacles. Others believe those obstacles are overstated. The disagreement is enormous. But the debate itself reveals something important. People no longer see this as just a celebrity story. They see it as an institutional story, a constitutional story, a monarchy story. And those stories operate very differently. Because institutions think differently than individuals. Individuals react emotionally.
Institutions reactent strategically.
Individuals focus on today. Institutions focus on decades, sometimes centuries. That's why so many royal experts believe future decisions will be based on institutional interests rather than personal feelings. Whether those decisions ever happen remains unknown. But the possibility keeps generating discussion, especially when commentators begin examining historical precedents. History matters in royal institutions. A lot. More than many people realize. Because monarchies often rely on precedent. What happened before? How was it handled? What authority existed? What mechanisms were used? These questions become incredibly important. And that's why commentators frequently look backward while trying to predict the future. Not because history repeats perfectly, but because history provides clues. Those clues help analysts understand what options may exist. And according to some royal writers, those options may be broader than many people assume. That's one reason legal discussions surrounding titles have attracted so much attention. Because titles aren't simply nicknames. They're institutional designations. They exist within larger structures. Structures that evolve over time. Structures that can be interpreted differently by different leaders. Structures that sometimes become subjects of intense debate. That's exactly where this story currently sits. Inside a debate. A debate about authority. A debate about interpretation. A debate about future possibilities. And while nobody can predict the outcome, everyone seems eager to discuss the possibilities. One reason is simple. The stakes appear high. Not necessarily because any dramatic action is guaranteed, but because the consequences of major changes would be significant. Imagine for a moment that some future adjustment occurred. Immediately, media outlets around the world would react. Legal experts would analyze every detail. Royal commentators would produce endless coverage. Social media would explode. The story would dominate headlines for weeks, maybe months. That possibility alone guarantees attention. Because attention follows uncertainty. And uncertainty is everywhere right now. What makes the situation even more interesting is that different groups interpret the same information differently. Supporters of Meghan often argue that critics exaggerate legal risks. They believe many discussions are driven more by speculation than reality. Critics argue the opposite. They believe commentators are underestimating the significance of institutional authority. Both sides present arguments. Both sides cite experts. Both sides believe they're correct, which means audiences are left trying to determine what to believe. And that creates the perfect environment for ongoing controversy. Because unresolved questions rarely disappear. They grow. They evolve. They attract new theories, new interpretations, new predictions. That's exactly what's happened here. Every new article creates fresh debate. Every new commentator introduces a new angle. Every new report generates new questions. And those questions often return to one central issue. What happens if a future king decides change is necessary? It's a simple question. Yet nobody agrees on the answer. Some analysts believe institutional authority would prevail. Others believe political realities would complicate any major decision. Some believe public opinion would become the deciding factor. Others believe public opinion would be largely irrelevant. Each argument has supporters. Each argument has critics. And each argument contributes to the mystery surrounding the story. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of all is timing, because timing changes everything. A decision made today might produce one outcome. The same decision made years later might produce a completely different outcome. Political climates change. Public attitudes change. Institutional priorities change. That's why many commentators emphasize patience, not because they know what's coming, but because they know major institutions rarely move quickly. They move deliberately, carefully, methodically, sometimes frustratingly slowly. Yet when they do move, the effects can be enormous. That's one reason why speculation surrounding William remains so intense. People aren't simply discussing a person. They're discussing a future role, a future responsibility, a future source of authority. And that distinction matters, because future kings are judged differently than current princes. The expectations change, the responsibilities change, the powers change, everything changes. Which means many commentators believe today's debates could look very different in the future. Maybe the controversy disappears entirely. Maybe it grows. Maybe it transforms into something nobody currently expects. All possibilities remain open. And that's precisely why audiences remain fascinated. Because uncertainty keeps people watching. But here's where the legal debate becomes even more intriguing. What if the real issue isn't legal authority at all? What if the real issue is public legitimacy? Because institutions don't operate in a vacuum. They operate in public view. And public reactions often matter almost as much as legal mechanisms. A technically possible decision may still carry public consequences. A legally sound action may still generate political controversy. A valid institutional move may still create enormous media backlash. That's why many experts caution against oversimplifying these debates. The law matters. Authority matters. Precedent matters. But public perception matters too. And when all four collide, predicting outcomes becomes incredibly difficult. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. Even if every legal pathway existed, even if every institutional mechanism were available, would using them actually be worth it? That's the question many analysts believe will ultimately determine everything. Because institutions don't just ask, "Can we do this?" They ask, "Should we do this?" And according to some royal observers, the answer to that second question may prove far more important than the first. Because while lawyers may debate documents, commentators may debate precedents, and social media may debate rumors, the final decision, if one is ever needed, would likely come down to something much simpler: a calculation about the future. The future of the monarchy, the future of public trust, and the future legacy of the people involved. And that brings us to the final chapter of this story. Because once we step back from the legal theories, the contracts, the titles, and the speculation, we are left with one final question. What happens next? After all the headlines, after all the rumors, after all the debates about titles, branding, money, and royal authority, we arrive at the one question nobody can answer with certainty. What happens next? Because despite thousands of articles, countless expert opinions, and endless social media discussions, the truth is surprisingly simple. Nobody knows. Not royal commentators, not biographers, not television analysts, not even the people closest to the story. Everyone has theories. Everyone has predictions. Everyone has assumptions. But the future remains unwritten. And that uncertainty is exactly why this story has become one of the most closely watched royal dramas of the decade. Because what we are really witnessing isn't just a disagreement about titles. It's a collision between two completely different visions of the future. On one side sits the traditional institution, an institution that has survived wars, scandals, political crises, and cultural revolutions. An institution that measures time differently than the rest of the world. While public attention shifts from week to week, institutions think in decades, sometimes centuries. And according to many royal observers, that long-term thinking may be the most important factor in understanding everything happening right now. Because institutions rarely react emotionally. They react strategically. They don't focus on today's headline. They focus on tomorrow's stability, the next generation, the next chapter, the next era. Which brings us back to Prince William. Throughout this entire controversy, William has remained one of the most discussed people despite saying very little publicly about it. And that's fascinating. Think about it. Every week new stories emerge. Every week new rumors appear. Every week commentators debate what William might do someday. Yet the man himself remains largely silent. For supporters, that silence reflects discipline. For critics, that silence creates mystery. For analysts, that silence creates opportunity. Because in the absence of direct answers, speculation rushes in to fill the gap. And that's exactly what's happened. Over time, William has become less of a person in these discussions and more of a symbol. A symbol of future authority. A symbol of future decisions. A symbol of a future monarchy that nobody has seen yet. That's why every rumor seems to return to him. Not because he created the conversation, but because people believe he may eventually shape how the story ends. Whether that's true remains unknown. But perception often drives headlines more powerfully than reality. And perception is driving this story harder than ever. Now let's look at Meghan's position. Because regardless of where people stand politically or personally, one fact remains undeniable. Few public figures generate more attention than Meghan Markle. Supporters see resilience. Critics see controversy. The media sees traffic. The internet sees engagement. And together those forces create a public figure who remains impossible to ignore. That's important because attention itself has become one of the most valuable assets in modern media. Every article, every interview, every appearance, every announcement generates discussion. And discussion generates visibility. Visibility generates influence. Influence creates opportunity. That cycle has powered modern celebrity culture for years. But what makes this situation unique is that Meghan's public identity exists at the intersection of celebrity culture and royal culture. Two worlds that operate very differently. Celebrity culture rewards visibility. Royal culture often rewards restraint. Celebrity culture thrives on personal branding. Royal culture traditionally emphasizes institutional identity. Celebrity culture encourages reinvención. Royal culture emphasizes continuity. Those competing forces have been present since the very beginning. And according to many commentators, they remain present today. Which is why every decision seems larger than it really is. Every headline feels more dramatic. Every rumor spreads faster. Every disagreement becomes symbolic. People aren't simply debating Meghan. They're debating what she represents. And the same applies to William. People aren't simply debating William. They're debating what kind of future monarchy he might create. That's why emotions run so high. Because beneath the headlines sits something much deeper. Competing visions. Competing expectations. Competing narratives. And nobody knows which narrative ultimately wins. Now let's talk about the scenario that has generated the most speculation. The possibility that some future royal decision could dramatically reshape the conversation. Notice something important. Most of the current debate isn't actually about what has happened. It's about what could happen. Potential future changes. Potential future decisions. Potential future consequences. Everything depends on possibilities. And possibilities are powerful. Because possibilities allow everyone to project their own expectations onto the future. Supporters expect one outcome. Critics expect another. Royal commentators predict something different. Biographers suggest another possibility entirely. Meanwhile, the future remains silent. Waiting. Unrevealed. Unknown. That's why this story continues growing. Because unresolved stories always attract attention. People want closure. People want answers. People want certainty. But certainty doesn't exist here. At least not yet. Instead, we have clues. Interpretations. Predictions. Speculation. Pieces of a puzzle that nobody has fully assembled. Some believe a major turning point is coming. Others believe the controversy is massively exaggerated. Some believe William will act decisively when the time comes. Others believe institutional realities will encourage caution. Again, nobody knows. But let's step back from the rumors for a moment, because the biggest lesson from this entire story might be simpler than people realize. Titles matter. Brands matter. Money matters. Legal questions matter. But relationships matter too. And beneath every headline sits a human story. Two brothers. One family. Years of distance. years of public scrutiny, years of competing narratives. For all the legal debates and financial discussions, that's still the emotional core of the story. That's the reason millions continue watching. Not because of documents, not because of contracts, not because of technical royal procedures. People watch because they're emotionally invested in the outcome. They want to know how the story ends. Will reconciliation ever happen? Will tensions continue? Will future generations repair the divide? Or will the distance grow even larger? Nobody knows. And that's why the audience keeps coming back. The mystery remains unsolved. But here's the detail that many analysts believe matters most. Time. Because time changes everything. It changes institutions. It changes public opinion. It changes priorities. It changes people. The story being told today may look completely different 5 years from now. The assumptions being made today may prove completely wrong. The predictions being made today may never happen. History is full of surprises. Royal history especially. And that's why smart observers remain cautious. They understand that certainty is dangerous. Predictions are risky. And the future has a habit of surprising everyone. Still, even with all that uncertainty, one thing seems clear. This story isn't ending anytime soon, because the questions at its center remain unanswered. What happens when William eventually becomes king? What happens to the relationship between the brothers? What happens to the public brand built around royal identity? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when speculation finally collides with reality? Those answers haven't arrived yet, but millions of people are watching for them. And until they do arrive, the debate will continue. The headlines will continue. The theories will continue. And the mystery will continue. Because in the world of royalty, sometimes the biggest story isn't what happened yesterday. It's what might happen tomorrow. So now it's your turn. After hearing the full breakdown, where do you think this story goes from here? Do you believe the speculation surrounding future royal title changes is being exaggerated? Or do you think major changes could eventually happen under a future King William? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this debate is far from over, and some of the biggest questions still don't have clear answers. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next royal update, analysis, or breaking development. See you in the next video.